Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Just to let you know, we'll start the presentation in about 1 minute. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much once again for joining us. Just to let you know, we will start the presentation in about 30 seconds. Well, an official hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast, Painting a Safer Picture, Enhancing Safety with Visual Literacy and EHS Software, sponsored by Benchmark Gensuite. This is Alan Ferguson, Associate Editor with Safety and Health and co-host of the On the Safe Side podcast, and I'll be moderating today's event. Thank you so much for joining us, and before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council of the magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session with our speakers. If you have a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and press the send button. We welcome your questions at any time during today's event. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. We might not get to every question, but the good news is unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. Also, after this presentation, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. Just to let you know, this webcast will be archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events, or you may also receive a link in our post-event email. With that, let's introduce our speakers. With us today are Donavan Hornsby and Doug Ponsler. Donavan, the Chief Market Strategy Officer at Benchmark Gensuite, has dedicated the past 20 years of his career to advancing EHS and sustainability principles and best practices in the industry. He provides strategic direction for global business, market development, and product leadership and innovation for his organization. In addition to his leadership responsibilities, Donavan is an active thought leader and member of cross-industry efforts to advance and promote the impact and best practices within EHS, sustainability, and ESG industries. Doug is the chairman and managing director at COVE, the Center for Visual Expertise. Launched in 2018 by the Toledo Museum of Art, COVE is dedicated to the application of visual literacy for industrial and service applications with an emphasis on safety. Doug is also the former vice president of EHS and operations sustainability at Owens Corning. He has also served as a member of the National Safety Council's board of directors and as chair of NSC's Campbell Institute. Additionally, he's a 2019 recipient of NSC's prestigious Distinguished Service to Safety Award. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. Donavan, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Alan. Appreciate it. Happy to have everybody here and happy to join Doug. Always enjoy our conversations and looking forward to more of that today. Just a quick item there in terms of the housekeeping that you mentioned there, Alan. We would love for folks, if you have questions, comments, please drop those in the chat. And as Alan said there, we'll keep an eye on, and if we have time, we'll have some response to those and some conversation as we go through here. Happy to spend a little bit of time with you today. In terms of agenda, we'd like to spend a little bit of time. I'm going to ask Doug to kick us off with a little bit more background on COVE and the great work that his team has been doing around visual literacy, a really interesting concept that I was introduced to a few years ago. And then I'll also provide a little bit of background on Benchmark Gensuite and the work that we do. And then I think, Doug, the great thing about this webinar here that we're hosting today is a nice kickoff, I think, to the partnership that we formalized earlier this year. Some of you may have seen the press release that went out, I think, in January. And so happy to kick off that partnership formally here with a little bit of a conversation around the work that we're doing. And also, I think better yet, the fact that we've combined forces here and looking to help folks promote what they're doing from a safety standpoint to their organizations. So after those overviews, we'll have a little bit of what I'm calling here a fireside chat. And as I heard from Doug earlier today, he's up in Toledo and things are a little bit chilly up there. So perhaps we should have hosted something next to a real fire instead of a virtual one, but we'll do our best today to keep you warm. And then we'll just wrap up and close. And if we have any questions at the end, we'll address those in the time that we have available. So with that, Doug, I'll turn it over to you and we'll get started.
Sounds good, Donovan. I think that idea of a fire would have been a good idea. It is temperature wise, it maybe it's not as cold as what it has been other days, but boy, with the wind blowing, it is chilly. So, but it's a pleasure to be here with you today. We Cove and Benchmark Gensuite have been friends for a long time. And I think you'll see today why a relationship between our companies at a minimum in thought leadership and extending far beyond that in terms of how tools can be applied in the workplace. If you're not familiar with visual literacy, let me just take a short minute here and kind of position when we say visual literacy, what are we talking about? And as was mentioned before, Cove is part of the Toledo Museum of Art and was really born out of lessons and things that are taught in art education. And it's a very natural thing when you think about art to develop skills and capabilities in terms of when we look at a work of art, what details do we see? How do we draw interpretation from those details in order to understand what the artist is trying to convey? And then how does that affect us? Is it something we like or we don't like? Does it reinforce beliefs we might have had, or does it change those beliefs? But it has an influence in terms of when we leave that work of art, how we might think about things, and maybe more importantly, what we might do as a result of that. Well, the same thing happens in the workplace. Each of us, as we go out and about, in our facilities, in our construction sites, and our distribution facilities, and we're out working with our team members, we're really doing the same thing. And that is, we're trying to understand through seeing details what might be important for us to be able to recognize in the workplace, particularly from a safety standpoint. And from that, we try to determine what it means. And based upon what we believe it means, for us, that's typically some form of a risk assessment. It defines essentially what action that we need then to take. So this translation of something that was taught in art education for a long, long time, but developing a new application to how those skills and capabilities apply in the workplace is what we're all about. So if we think about the workplace, there's lots of hazards in the workplace that often do go unnoticed. And that doesn't mean they're necessarily hidden from view. It can mean that we're just so used to seeing them that we just no longer see them. And if you've been involved in a incident review or something like that, you may have heard someone at one point in time say, I've walked by that, put a frequency to it, every day, 1,000 times, 100 times, whatever. And I never saw it until the incident occurred. But there it was in plain sight, but it became so familiar to us that we no longer saw it. The visual literacy tools gives us the capability, it gives us a tool set that we can use to take what has become familiar and make it unfamiliar again. And if there is a very simple definition of visual literacy that I would want you to remember, it is simply that visual literacy is all about what we see, what it means, and what we do about it. And if we think about visual literacy that way, its translation to the work environment, I think, is very clear. There's one word in this slide that I would also like to focus on, and that is in the last line, a proactive safety culture. When we talk about where we are on a maturity curve about when it comes to safety, are we primarily reacting or are we being proactive in what we do? There's no question that we want to be proactive. And in order to be proactive, we have to see the hazards that exist and the risks that they represent prior to an incident occurring. So I always like to think about visual literacy as being one of the most proactive things that we can do because we develop a capability and a competency that we can see things in advance and we don't have to wait for that incident, to occur and then inform us that we have something to go fix. So we can go to the next slide. Seeing is preventing, and that goes to the proactiveness of visual literacy. But if we think about its application to safety, I want you to focus on the diagram that's on the right side of the slide. And on the inner side, we see this triangle, and this triangle represents what a typical hazard identification process might look like. If we look at the left side, we see an existence of a hazard. If we look at the right side, we see a risk assessment, us determining, sort of the severity or the potential severity of that hazard that we've identified. And then across the top is the action step that we take. So you can just kind of, see yourself moving around this triangle in order to be able to identify those concerns, to be able to understand what they mean, and be able to take the action that is appropriate. And that is what I just described as the definition of what visual literacy is all about. Visual literacy is all about what we see. If we improve our ability to see, we're able to identify more inputs. It's those inputs that we use in our risk assessment process to understand the sort of things that we need to do. And as an output of the risk assessment process, we define those actions that are most important, most meaningful, and need to be taken in order to be able to protect our people. If we do all that, we should eliminate and reduce the number of workplace incidents that occur because we've seen the risk in advance and we've dealt with it. We can also communicate more effectively with our employees about the conditions that they might be working around, and they can communicate with what they see as being issues in their particular work area, their facility, their construction site. And those two things together really help us build and reinforce that strong culture of proactive safety that we're all trying to accommodate. Next slide. There are some barriers to reporting safety observations or things that our workers might see in the workplace, and it may prevent them from being as candid and as capable as what we want them to be to talk to us about what it is that we're seeing. Sometimes we're concerned that if we express concerns, there might be a negative connotation to that there might be some retaliation. There might be a feeling that, we've got enough to do. We don't need more people bringing us more problems to solve. Often, that's a good sign of a poor safety culture. If we're not interested in understanding what our employees are seeing and feeling, if we're not interested in being able to solve the issues that need to be solved in order to be able to protect ourselves and others, that's not the sort of safety culture that I believe any of us that are on the call would advocate for. We certainly want to be better than that. We're all busy. We've all got a lot of things to do. Sometimes in the interest of getting our to-do list completed, we have time constraints that maybe we don't spend the amount of time that we need to understand the risks that are present, in our work environment. And the reality is, in order to be able to do that, we have to slow down just a bit and be able to see the world around us the way that it is so we can do something about those things that need action taken. In some cases, and this is particularly true with maybe organizations that are not as mature as others, that even if I observe something or I see something, is there a process? Are there tools available in order to be able to report in a meaningful way what it is that I'm observing? And going back to the triangle before, if I don't have a way to report those hazards that I see, our ability to execute the rest of the processes like the risk assessment and taking action, will be limited as a result. And then there's lots of other things that, if we opened up our discussion today, that I know many of you would add, other things that we haven't mentioned. But the one thing that I would add is that if we don't have the ability to actually see the environment as it is. If we're not visually acute, if we're not applying discipline and structure to how we look at things, we have the opportunity to then miss things that we will walk by time and time again until something happens and calls that particular concern to our attention. And that is why visual literacy is so important and so impactful to the work that we do to create a proactive safety culture. So next slide.
I think we were looking to launch a poll, if I'm not mistaken, Doug.
Yeah, here we go. So let me ask you just two questions, and we'll take them one at a time. And we'll use this to sort of educate you a bit on some of the aspects of visual literacy. So the first question is, we may see as little as what % of what we look at? So go ahead and select one of those options in terms of how much when we look at something do we really see. So I'll give you about 45 seconds or so to make your selection. Okay. So it looks like the predominance has identified 10%. Sort of second in that ranking is 25 is the 65%, and then 50%, I guess 50% is 29%, and then 65% is the third. So we have a relatively educated audience in terms of visual literacy. The correct answer is 10%. When we look at something, we don't see everything that's there. And we'll see, depending upon conditions, depending upon where we might be at the moment, there's a wide range in terms of what we see, but we may see as little as 10% of what we look at. And the brain fills in the rest based upon factors that the brain considers to do that. So 10% is the correct answer. So we'll go to the second poll question. And the second poll question really relates to the first one, and that is what we think we are seeing is heavily influenced by, and we're going to ask you to make a single choice, our experiences, our expectations, our biases, or all of the above. So again, we'll give you about 30 to 45 seconds and see how well you do with this one. Okay, let's see. Everyone took the safe answer, and that's all the above. And all the above is correct. Neurologically, as the brain brings this visual stimuli together that we collect with our eyes and process in our brain, it does it really recognizing heavily our experiences, our expectations, and our biases in order to be able to pull together a story, to pull together an explanation that will make sense to us. The good news is the brain's really, really good at it. The bad news is it's not perfect, especially when conditions are different or have changed from what our experiences, our expectations might have indicated. So again, we've got a really educated audience here, and nicely done on those first two poll questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Donavan.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it. I always love those polls. Unfortunately, I couldn't see them, but I appreciate you doing the colored commentary as they were coming in. No, I think that's a great background, and hopefully folks have a good understanding, at least a general understanding of what visual literacy is all about. I know that I had been introduced to it a few years back, and one of the big things that we've been focused on over the past couple of decades is, as you see on the top of this screen right now, helping organizations operationalize safety performance. And what I mean by that is really translating what they're looking to do from an organizational objectives and mission standpoint into what actually happens in reality on the shop floor, if you will, or out in the field. And I'm going to come back to that concept in just a minute here. And one thing that I'd like to come through in our conversation today is a little bit better understanding, at least a start of an understanding on how folks can take the concepts like visual literacy and operationalize them within your sites and the things that you're doing out there, either on the shop floor or in the field as well, whether that's through your folks like your supervisors, if you happen to be fortunate enough to have dedicated safety professionals or EHS folks on the floor, but then more importantly, I think through the front line, and I'm going to speak to that in just a second here. And just a quick background, a little bit of context before I jump into here. One thing I spoke a couple weeks ago at the NSC hosted their Future of EHS event there in St. Louis, and I spoke about a couple of these concepts here. And one of the things that I talked about, in the 20 plus years that we've been doing this, one of the big, I think, challenges and gaps that we've had as an industry, and you touched on this, Doug, is around culture. And I think the problem with culture, the challenge with, and the reason why there's been so many books and presentations on it is because I think in a lot of ways it's this kind of esoteric notion. It's kind of mystical, and folks have, I think, a difficulty in understanding how they translate that into practical steps that can be taken there. And so one of the things that we've been working on for the past couple of decades is trying to help organizations build culture organically by helping them better connect with folks out there on the front line that are trying to take that vision and mission and objectives for their EHS programs or safety programs and demonstrate that through their day-to-day work every day. And that's kind of really been what's been driving us. So I had kicked off a couple weeks ago at NSC my presentation with this chart, and I'm sure most of you have seen this before. And I heard a couple of bugs in the audience because as safety professionals, we've sat through a number of presentations that take a look at the blue line, black line. And the reason I bring this up is because I'd like to take a slightly different perspective on this. A lot of folks, when they're talking about this, they're talking about this gap that you see out there between expectations and what's actually happening on that shop floor and in the field. And it's a measure. This is more like an outcome, a measure of outcomes, if you will. What I'd like to do is to think about this more in terms of the gap between what's actually happening out there in terms of what the front lines expectations are and leadership's understanding of that as well. So when you think about the frontline folks out there that are doing the day-to-day work out there, in many cases they lack a connection to what's going on and what's expected from an organizational standpoint. And on the flip side, leadership lacks an understanding in many cases. It's demonstrated through and through with the actual reality of the work there. And so there tends to be this disconnect. And a lot of that disconnect, I think, is also demonstrated when you think about, Doug, when you're talking about the barriers. I think one of your barriers there over to the right was around having tools in place that can help establish that connection. And when I think about our experience over the past couple of decades and how as EHS organizations, a lot of times what we do is that we will take a program, set of objectives, and we will push that down and then out through the organization. But in many cases, it doesn't always make it what I like to call that kind of last, most difficult mile, if you will, to the front line. And in a lot of cases, if you think about how maybe you've rolled out your tools and things like that, we have BBS programs, safety observation programs, where we have expectations that maybe our supervisors will walk around and they'll conduct safety observations on a weekly basis. And we give them this standard checklist of things to look at and things. In many ways, we're not engaging, taking that next mile and engaging folks in the front line. We might have out there, a box, a suggestion box, or maybe a good catch methodology where they're capturing these things and then hopefully getting to the right person. But it's really, you know, when you think about how we've deployed tools, we haven't really taken it to the next step. And that's what I'm so excited about, what you're doing with visual literacy. And I know we'll talk a little bit about this in the latter half of today's session here, about how you practically make this work and how you engage, you know, not only the leadership and supervisors, but also those folks on the front line in building that visual literacy capability. Because one of the things that we struggle with and have struggled with for a long time is because we've taken this kind of top-down kind of approach to pushing out these expectations and driving programs and processes, that we're not engaging those folks to the extent we can. And, you know, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. I think that one of the main reasons is that we haven't put the right tools in their hands. And I think we're just as guilty of this as anybody else. You know, for many years, we've been trying to perfect, you know, we went from paper and then went from paper to the kind of the earlier stages of mobile devices and things like that. And I think many of your organizations probably are using at least kiosks out there near the shop floor. Maybe you've been using tablets and phones and things like that to conduct some of these things to capture information. So if they have a good catch or they want to record a near miss, you know, now they can do that at the point of action potentially with a device like this. But still, in many cases, when you look at some of the reasons why maybe folks haven't adopted this on the front lines as much as you had hoped, a lot of it has to do with just the complexity, either of the device or maybe of the forms that you're putting in front of them. They just aren't simple enough. Or in some cases, there's this disconnect between what you're asking them to assess and walk through and the nature of their work. And so truly, I know we talk about this all the time, but I don't think that we fully cracked the nut on this. A lot of what you're asking folks to do from maybe a risk assessment standpoint isn't truly integrated into the work that they're doing, or it might be a case where what we're asking them to do is just too cumbersome, either from a device standpoint or just from the actual content of the questions you're having them ask and things like that. And that's what I love about the visual literacy concept, is that you're now able to take this and equip folks with a different way to see and a different way to kind of take in their environment. And I'm not using as eloquent of words as you would use, Doug, to describe it, but when I think about this, you know, one of the things that we've been doing over the past couple of years, we've been building in some generative AI capabilities into our platform. And one of the big focus areas that we've had over the past couple of years is trying to drive better quality, more robust information being captured at the front line. So if you take, for example, safety observations, or you take some ability for folks to log a concern, log a good catch or near miss and things like that, oftentimes we are handcuffing them, if you will, by giving them a set of prompts that kind of direct them down a very specific channel. And it doesn't allow them to kind of see freely and describe freely. And so one of the things that we've been working on through these things we call kind of generative AI helpers, and at least initially, was to help improve the quality and the robustness of those inputs. So, you know, if somebody's out there and they see some issue out there, you know, basically prompting them, encouraging them to dig deeper, to provide more colorful, more insightful information that we can then use as leadership to be able to understand where we have legitimate risks that we need to go after, and to understand where we might find those same risks or similar risks in other parts of our operations. And so what I love about visual literacy is that you're equipping folks with the ability to see differently, see more expansively, if you will, see more robustly, and then being able to, you know, translate that into information that we capture, you know, kind of similar to what you see on the right-hand side of the screen there, in some type of narrative. And so we're not kind of forcing them through boxes that they have to tick off. We're just asking them to share what they see. And, you know, then you have this robust information coming in that then we can use tools like AI, for example, to analyze that information and to identify, you know, risks and then maybe even and suggest mitigation controls and things like that that folks can put in place in order to address those risks. And so that's as much as I've been excited about the introduction of generative AI to help improve a lot of the quality and robustness of the information, and then on the tail end of that process, the insights that we derive from it, folks still need, I think, the capability that visual literacy offers to see differently and see more robustly so that we can have much better information to act on. So hopefully that's been helpful for folks. I know we wanted to spend the first half of today's conversation just giving you a little bit of background on the concepts and to understand how Doug and I and our teams have been thinking about the integration, the nexus, if you will, of the best practices that we've been working to perfect over the past number of years here, where I think it's a super powerful combination to have those tools to be able to eliminate a lot of those barriers that you spoke about, Doug, in order to build strong cultures, put right tools in folks' hands, but then also give them the capabilities through visual literacy to see differently and more robustly so that we can have the type of information that we need in order to act on it and to be more insightful moving forward. So hopefully that's been helpful to folks. What I'd like to do now is just to kind of transition, no more PowerPoint slides other than the one that you'll see up on the screen and perhaps some of our faces as well. But I'd like to kind of shift gears here to a little bit more of a kind of fireside chat format, if you will. And Doug, what I can kick us off here and just maybe prompt you with a question that I've been wondering about, and I know others may on the phone as well. I think visual literacy, although maybe relatively new to me, is not a new concept. I think it's been utilized in maybe some different spaces for several years now. I'm curious as to why you think it's found a place in safety and why it's kind of at the forefront of conversation now.
Yeah, so a really good question, Donovan, and I think there's a couple answers to that. I'm going to let me start with the desire that I think all companies have to improve and to get better and create a safer working environment. We have been at this for a long, long time, and we've made really tremendous progress if you look back 30, 40 years in terms of how safely people are able to work, in our work environments. Although that has flattened out a bit. And if we think about serious injury and fatality prevention in particular, that has really flattened out.
Yeah.
So, we're really, after improvement. And the only way we get improvement is to be able to do something differently, build on the successes that we've had, and do something differently, do something that's innovative, do something that, will help us achieve what we're trying to achieve. And I think along with that has been more openness to look outside of the traditional four walls of how we might have defined environmental health and safety and look for solutions that come from other disciplines. We talk a lot more about wellness today. We talk about fatigue today. We talk about mental health. We talk about a lot of things that were really not in the conversation maybe 20 years ago or 25 years ago. I think visual literacy is one more example of how we can look at something like the arts and we can see how the key learnings, the key understandings, and in our case, the key processes associated with one aspect of the arts really matters in the workplace. And it matters in being able to see the reality of our workplace. So that desire to drive improvement, that desire to look for new and innovative solutions, and that desire to look outside of the normal realm of what we consider to be the discipline of environmental health and safety, I think has opened minds to be able to see visual literacy as a solution for many aspects of what we're confronted with in today's world. I think the other part of it is that from a technology standpoint and from the applications that are available to us today, I mean, they are so powerful and they can do so many things and they can provide insights and they can manage data in a way that we as humans, never could or never can. But they're still dependent upon inputs. So the more inputs that we have, I've never met a data scientist that wasn't hungry for more inputs, for example. But the more inputs that we can have, the better the tools will function and the better the insights and the actions will be. And visual literacy is important to being able to make the visual observations that are so important to the work that we do in environmental health and safety.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Doug, you bring up this notion around more information. I think it's not just the data scientists that are hungry for more information. I think safety leadership, operational leadership is also hungry for more information.
Absolutely.
But it's a double-edged sword. I know this is one thing that we've been wrestling with, within Benchmark Gensuite, but certainly we've heard this loud and clear across our subscriber community. More information, it also makes things more challenging to to draw from that insights that folks can act on. This is why, I made this point a few times just before we kind of transition into the fireside chat here. More information isn't always better. What I would love is to have better information. And because the reality is, and I know that this is part of the promise of AI, and we've been working for a few years now to develop some kind of what we're calling risk advisors that will basically act on huge volumes of information in order to draw out, tease out insights that maybe aren't possible by folks manually reviewing the information. It's just not humanly possible. But at the same time, and I think it's great that we're working on those technologies, but I also, to your point, believe that we need to look for ways to improve the quality of the information that we are getting. And so there's certainly a question around quality over quantity in my mind, and I think visual literacy certainly helps us address that.
Yeah, a key part of visual literacy is actually our ability to communicate what it is that we're seeing. And we think about visual literacy often as our interpretation of what we're looking at, but rarely are we able to accomplish things solely on our own. So we also have to be able to communicate what we see. And being able to communicate in an objective way, in a detailed way, where others can understand what we're seeing and systems can use that objective language in order to be able to understand it from a digital perspective, it's really important. One of the things that we talk a lot about at Cove is really the and conversation, A&D. And we call that and conversation between the technology that we're deploying, but also continuing to build the personal competencies and capabilities of people to not only interact with the technology, but also to be really good critical thinkers, to be good problem solvers, to be good communicators. Visual literacy offers support, it offers tools, it offers capabilities in that personal competency, sort of way. So if we can take technology and make it an and conversation with building personal competencies, then we've got a winning formula there, and
For sure.
and that's key to getting anything done.
Yeah, for sure. And when you talk about building personal competencies, I think one thing that folks may be wondering, I know when you and I first started talking about this concept some time back, my initial question, maybe my initial assumption was that this is something that you and the Cove team are, like a better word, teaching and coaching to leadership. Is there a play here for the folks on the front line to be able to learn visual literacy? And I guess maybe just speak to that, how you approach leadership and how you approach the front line, because, as I mentioned earlier, I think that's the secret to this, is that we have to connect to the front line in better ways.
No question, no question. All levels of the organization benefit from understanding what visual literacy is and why it matters, and understanding the tools that we utilize in order to be able to deliver that improved visual experience, that opportunity to identify more, see more that's around us. We often, do focus maybe too much on the top of the organization and the leadership level, and we don't give the people that are at the point of the spear, the sort of tools that they need. So when we talk about visual literacy within the organization, we're talking about at all levels. And, there may be some levels that understand in a deeper way, sort of the science and the neuroscience component of visual literacy, but the tools and the techniques that we utilize to slow ourselves down and be able to see what's around us applies to that frontline worker as well as it does anyone else. We certainly want people that are going out and doing audits and assessments to be able to see effectively, to be able to identify concerns. But we also want that individual that's going to reach for a wrench, or they're going to move a product of some sort, or crawl on a lift truck. We want them to be able to see more effectively as well. So it strikes at all levels of the organization. The approach may be a little bit different in terms of what outcome we're looking for, but it all matters at all levels.
Yeah, for sure. So when you think about the projects, initiatives that you've done with organizations over the years, you think about everything from the training to the deployment of these methodologies and things like that. What typically gets in the way? If maybe some organizations struggle, why do they struggle with these things?
Yeah, I'll turn that question upside down and say what makes organizations more effective, perhaps,
Sure.
in utilizing and having an impact with visual literacy. And for us, it all comes down to having an expectation and having an expectation of where we're going to see improvement as a result of digging in from a visual literacy standpoint. Teaching visual literacy in a general awareness kind of way, we see less improvement as a result of approaching it that way than what we do when someone says, I want to improve my hazard identification process. I measure how many hazards are identified. It's gotten stale, it's gotten flat. I want to be able to improve the number of hazards we're identifying. And we can focus on a metric like that and then use visual literacy training as an enabler to be able to improve the metric. So we counsel, all of our clients that move to an implementation side to first and foremost select a metric or metrics that you're focused on improving, and then let's tie the visual literacy training to improving that metric.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah. I think that's the other question I have for you too. Do you think that visual literacy is, sometimes you have, things that concepts like this that I think seem very progressive in a way, and outside the norm, and folks maybe think that this is just the purview of large organizations, maybe organizations with more mature programs and processes. Do you agree with that, or do you feel like this is open to any size organization, different levels of maturity and programs? I'm just curious to know what your experiences have been.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that larger organizations tend to have a structure, process, procedure, in place, that they can bolt capabilities like this on and enhance what those processes and procedures look like. I think smaller organizations can benefit the same way, though, because where you might not have the sophisticated systems in place, you still have people, that are focused on getting a job done and getting a job done safely. And being able to utilize those skills associated with visual literacy helps those individuals do that. So I think while the way it looks may be different in a large organization versus a small organization, the deliverables and the outcomes are really can be the same, because this is an individual capability and competency, sort of discussion.
Yeah, for sure. I do believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
So
it's.
Donovan,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I've got a question for you as well.
Sure. Yeah.
And my question is really around the fact that in our personal lives, we all are experiencing a lot of digitalization, in what we do each and every day outside the workplace. That can be everything from banking and bill paying to ordering concert tickets or, you name it. We're going to, in many cases, to a website, a web form, and doing the sort of things that we need to do. Do you see that personal experience that we have outside the workplace makes it easier in the workplace to implement some of the digital solutions that you offer?
Oh, for certain. Yeah. Yeah, and I kind of touched on a little bit of this during my kind of overview segment there in terms of simplicity and form factor and things like that. But if I look back to, let's say, the I don't know, maybe the past 5 or 6 years, hopefully folks have gathered here. Our core technology is think of it as kind of an enterprise software, EHS management system, if you will. But then what complements that are various technologies. So I talked a little bit about mobile devices, whether it's tablets or phones, but we've worked with a whole bunch of other types of things. And if I think back to some of the experiments, I'll call them, and pilot projects that we've done in the past with things like wearables and these types of hardware and things like that, where they failed, I believe, has been primarily in the form factor and the lack of simplicity. So, for example, I know that when we started first experimenting 5 or 6 years ago with the kind of VR glasses and things like that, where folks could utilize that as they're walking around doing a safety observation. What we found, and a lot of the feedback that we heard from folks was that the form factor just wasn't right, still felt awkward, just didn't feel natural. And perhaps some of that will change as we have younger folks coming into the ranks, safety ranks and things like that. And I guess it remains to be seen if those folks will adopt that form factor. I'm sure we'll improve that form factor. But it's simple things like that. It sounds really interesting, and it's got a tremendous amount of wow factor and shiny object syndrome and things like that. But the reality is that it doesn't feel natural to folks. It's not simple to folks. They're not going to use it. And any major investment or grand plans you had are going to fall flat as soon as you put it in those folks' hands. And I think that's why I'm holding up my phone right now. To your point, to the extent that you can leverage things that folks are already comfortable with, that they already use, as you said, in their personal lives, and it just then is extended into the workplace, I think we're better for it. Which is why I mentioned earlier a lot of the work that we've been doing. We brought in a new technology, new company called Anvil at the end of last year, and I believe they've cracked the nut on this. They have this amazingly super simple, slick interface, and back to my comments around our approach has always been kind of top down and kind of pushing out technology and programs and processes. They started from a complete opposite approach. They put devices with super simple to use forms in the hands of the folks out there that are going to climb that utility pole or jump in that ditch or whatever, and they had to perform some type of pre-job safety assessment or whatever the case might be, tailgate talk type thing. And so they started with that. They started at the point of action, the closest you can get to the front line. I mean, they are at the front line, but they started at it not thinking, okay, how do I take this grand complex vision I have and then try to simplify that down. They started from the bottom up with the most simplest approach, and it's been adopted super fast. And I think it's because they got the form factor right and they got the simplicity right, which is why I think I'm super excited about our partnership, because if you can take and you can equip somebody on the front line or supervisors with this new ability to see through visual literacy, and you can just put something in their hands that's just going to record them sharing their observations. So if you imagine me walking around a plant and I'm just kind of, as you have folks kind of scanning the environment, working from the outside in is one of your big principles at Cove. And then I'm just sharing observations that cause me concern. Then I'm just capturing that by voice in a mobile device, whether it's a phone or a tablet. And then the rest is just magic from there, because then you have this robust information. It doesn't mean everything they share is something that you can act on, but you have this universe of information that you can then tease out the things that matter most, and then inform where you spend all your time. So that was a long-winded answer, but I think it starts with simplicity. It starts with form factor. And then if you have that capability, the two can work really, really well together.
Yeah, I think there's aspects of what you said, Donovan, that directly connect with visual literacy as well, because, where we may have experiences in our personal lives that we can bring to the workplace from a technology perspective and understand technology that we're trying to utilize. The same thing's true with regard to visual literacy, where we may learn about it in the workplace, but it affects our personal lives as well. I mean, the idea that we can walk by something and not see it doesn't just happen in the workplace. It happens at home as well. And for many people, the safest part of their day is when they're at work, and they're 7 or 8 times more likely to have an incident outside the workplace than they are in the workplace. So when we're able to deploy a tool like visual literacy that impacts how we see, how we interpret what we see, not just the time we're in the workplace, but 24/7, we have the opportunity to be able to influence safe lives, not just safe working lives.
No doubt. So I think the time check here, we've got a little bit less than 10 minutes. What I'd like to do maybe is transition to Q&A here. And I can't see the Q&A panel there. I'm not sure if Alan can or you can, but if we have any questions that have come in from the audience, love to address those. And while we're doing that, I'll pop this screen here so folks can jump online and take a look at more information.
Yeah, thank you so much to thanks so much to you both. Before we start the Q&A, we want to remind everyone the evaluations we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar, and your input is important because it does help us improve our future webcast. And as a reminder for our attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And once again, if we don't get to your question, all answered questions will be forwarded along to our speakers. I had a question for Doug, personally. What is it like to see someone have an aha moment while going through a visual literacy exercise?
Oh, it's awesome to begin with. And we teach most of our workshops we do actually in museums, beginning with the Toledo Museum of Art, which is our home, but we do them in museums, in other places as well. And when we take, a workshop group, from the classroom into the galleries, and we start to take a look at works of art in order to be able to teach, the tools and the techniques that we utilize, it is it's so encouraging to see people interact with the art and really go all in to trying to understand what the artist is trying to convey. And it just puts them in a total different learning space, than what they might be if it was only, PowerPoint or online training. And they really, really enjoy it. And I could go on and on about that, but, that's what I see in the participants is it's an opportunity to have an experience that they might not normally have. And then we always bring it back to the workplace. We focus on learning with art, but application using workplace examples. And I think it makes it a very safe learning way for people to understand what we're teaching.
Yeah, I also had a personal question for Donovan. Could you give an example or two of some additional color that someone would add to a risk description from the front line?
Well, sure. I mean, I think we've all had this experience before where you'll get somebody that logs, near miss or concern that they have there, and it's or maybe you're recording initial report of an incident, and how many times do they report something super minimal information? It goes back, however it gets to leadership or their supervisor, and it initiates this back and forth conversation. Well, that's fine, but I need more about this. I need more about this. And so this is actually what I mentioned earlier. We have this thing embedded, this generative AI capability embedded into our forms where it's called Describe It. And so as folks are entering information, it's basically scoring or grading their response, based on some sense of what is robust, if you will. And so it's prompting them. So if, for example, there's a spill, well, don't just say there's a spill. Let's talk a little bit about, what it might be, where it is, these types of things. And so it's just really, it's just a lot of basic, a lot of folks are busy out there. You talked about the barriers, Doug, and when folks are out there and they're just on the job and they just want to get this thing done. And so to the extent that they can now look at that scene through a different lens, to Doug's point, but then also have the tools prompt them. So for example, if they're describing, a situation, prompt them with relevant questions, help tease out and draw out some more information that we can act on.
Yeah, once again, as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So our next question for Doug, do workers really connect with something that comes from the art world?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And, it may sound intimidating, particularly if you're not familiar with art or you haven't spent time in art museums. It may seem a little intimidating that you're going to go to an art museum for training when you're attending training that's done at an art museum. But what I've seen is frontline workers may be sometimes the quickest to sort of leave behind their normal experience and really dig into whether it's a work of art or it's an exercise that we're doing that might be a drawing exercise that they're doing. They leave all that behind. They dig into what we're doing because it's a really safe space. When you're working with art, in some cases, there's no wrong answer. So, it's up to everyone's individual sort of perspective. And that's okay because they also make the connection with why they believe that. So, it proves to be a very safe space to learn. And while people may have some initial anxiety, it doesn't take long before that is gone. And then it's all hands on deck.
Our next
Doug, do you ever take art to the organizations, to the plants where you go to do this?
We do. Yeah,
Oh, wow. Great.
yeah, if we have a workshop or if we have a training experience that we're providing that's not at an art museum, we take with us what we need, to be able to conduct that exercise, successfully. So now we're not going to bring an original work of art from the 18th century to we're not going to take it off the wall and put it in the trunk and off we go. But we will bring imagery, we'll bring copies, we'll bring those sort of things with us that allow us to replicate the museum experience and achieve the learning outcomes.
For our next question, what is your suggestion for a company that's trying to have more corrective actions?
Well,
Go ahead, Doug.
I'll take an initial shot at that. I think what's important about trying to drive corrective actions is that we're learning from the incident in terms of what happened, so that we can make sure we're connecting the corrective actions that we establish to the actual experience that we had with the incident. And the second thing, and typically, there's not just one single thing. Typically, there's a number of factors that contributed, and we have to dig deep to make sure that we're taking into account all the things that we need to take into account, which in and of itself will often generate a number of corrective actions. And then the other thing that I would add is the quality of the corrective actions are important as well, because we all know when we think about the hierarchy of controls, if we're not implementing corrective actions that are at the top of the, depending on the model you use, that if we're implementing corrective actions that are not engineering oriented, that are not elimination or substitution oriented, then we're going to run the risk that our more administrative corrective actions will break down and we'll just experience that incident again at a later time. So pushing for higher level of corrective actions can also cause more corrective actions to develop.
Yeah, and Doug, I would just build on that. I think the other thing that we've seen through the years, I'm sure you remember this in your time leading EHS as well. A lot of times we'll implement some corrective actions at one site, but yet we're still experiencing similar types of incidents in other sites. And this is obviously where I'm biased here, but this is where systems and solutions come into play, because we want to be able to not keep learning that lesson over and over again at every site, because most of us have enough similarities in terms of operational profile, processes, job activities, and things like that, that we should be able to take those lessons learned, those corrective actions, those types of incidents, and spread that across the organization. And this is where obviously safety solutions, systems, and things like this can help us with that, because you can very quickly, very easily identify similar sites, similar operating profiles, and then alert those folks to say, hey, if you have these types of activities, is something we found over here, it's likely that you're going to run into this at some point over here. So let's go ahead and get some controls in place.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you so much to you both. Unfortunately, we have run out of time today. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. We'd like to thank Donavan Hornsby, Doug Ponsler, the entire team from our sponsor, Benchmark Gensuite, and of course, all of you who joined us today. Take care and have a safe day.
Thanks, Alan.